Good morning, viewers. Today I am present before you with the work of Geoffrey Chaucer entitled The Canterbury Tales. In today's podcast, I will be talking about realism in Canterbury Tales. Before I begin the podcast, it is advisable that you keep a notebook and a pen so that you can jot down the important points relating to this particular topic. It is further advisable to use earplugs for listening to the podcast. So here I begin. Chaucer has an unending interest in life. With an unfailing good humor, he accepts things as they are and exercising his wonderful capacity for enjoyment takes delight in everything and invites his readers to share the enjoyment with him. In his earlier works, the elements of medieval romance and moral allegory predominate. But even in them, there is an unmistakable realistic bias, though they deal primarily with abstractions or with the utopian land of the heart's desire. In the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer sets out with a specific aim to produce the effect of unstudied realism, shunting other things to the background. He selects his pilgrims with care, men and women who represent the broad cross sections of life. He makes them at once typical and individual by making them dynamic and fully human, and thus achieves a sense of realism unprecedented and also rarely equalled later on. Chaucer is truly the social chronicler of England at the end of the 14th century. What he has given is a direct transcription of daily life taken in the very act, as it were, and in its most familiar aspects. The two other famous writers of the period, Langland and Gower, give flashes of realism through their allegories, but they cannot steer clear of the strong influence of the political condition of their time. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, politics does not intrude into the picture of life. Chaucer's pilgrims are just the children of the soil, men and women who lead their own lives fully and completely. Their actions and sentiments are such as are normal in everyday life, and that is why we feel that they are in the poem such as they were in reality, why they are true to life and form the very backbone of that history which they care so little about. The intensity of realism in the Canterbury Tales can be understood from a significant fact about the pilgrims portrayed by Chaucer. The Middle Age was a period when the social hierarchy was a very important feature of social life. The twin ladders of life were church and state. Under these two broad categories came the different steps on the ladder, the high and the low, each confined within the straitjacket of its own social life. It was a highly conventional arrangement and did not fully reflect the actual conditions. It is Chaucer's deep insight which makes him accept the hierarchies and at the same time ignore them in the interest of artistic verisimilitude. Chaucer harmonizes the sense of hierarchy with the sense of actuality. The picture of life must be natural and not as the conventions of the Middle Age would warrant. This is true not merely of the prologue, but of the entire Canterbury Tales. It is simple but genuine realism everywhere in the poem, and the arrangement of the pilgrims, the general order in which the stories are told, and also the contents of a vast majority of the stories clearly show that Chaucer aims at providing the reader with the dynamic aspect of the life of his times. An interesting artistic point emerges here, the poet's handling of time. Chaucer's realism is that of the poet who, going along the path of time, makes the pilgrims dynamic by giving each one of them the proper scope for revealing himself or herself and takes life as a constant movement, as the ride of the pilgrims from the Tabard in London to the Canterbury Cathedral indicates. Chaucer's art is not of the photographer, pure and simple. His art is a blending of the twin arts of expert photography and imaginative painting. Chaucer has in his mind actual men and women when he describes the pilgrims one by one. It is quite probable that some of them are drawn from amongst the acquaintances of the poet too. The pilgrims in Chaucer's pages stand and move all by themselves and are sufficiently individualized. And it is not at all necessary to go and search for their originals in real life in order to understand them. Throughout the poem, the aim of the poet is to describe the sundry folks who gather at the tabard and then ride toward Canterbury and then narrate their stories. As a poet and artist, he is primarily interested in varied and picturesque human figures suitable for the telling of the tales. So, in Chaucer's masterpiece, an impressive and living picture of the 14th century England and the 30 and odd pilgrims whom he describes are the living characters in the great drama of life of the period. It is worth noticing that Chaucer excludes from the party of pilgrims the two extremities of life, the highest, the barons and the bishops, and the lowest, the ragamuffins. This he does for the very obvious reason that these two classes do not fit into the scheme of a collective pilgrimage to Canterbury. But when exception has been made about them, we find that Chaucer's pilgrims cover the entire society of the time. If the pilgrims appear to be divided into definite groups, it must be borne in mind that it is entirely our grouping. For Chaucer, notwithstanding all the careful selection that must have gone behind their introduction into the poem, takes them as it were in the lump, in the haphazardly of life and on absolute equal terms. The way in which he handles them shows his attitude to life and thereby his great genius. He has the innocent, vivid, and bright gaze of the child. He has also the mature power of discernment, full of intelligence and wit, and these two are happily blended when he sets upon writing the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's pilgrims thus do not grow from within, from their own characterizations and conversations, actions, and the impetus of their basic qualities to be manifested in outward actions. Perhaps the host of the tabard is an exception. His peculiar position among the pilgrims accounts for this, but they are created by the poet who carefully observes them, adds up to the little bits that he sees, and finally gives each one of them a local habitation and a name. They are just as people are to appear to one another in a party of pilgrims met by chance and impressing one another more by their outward appearances than by their spiritual essences. Chaucer's realism is exactly of this type. A reading of the prologue shows that the sketches of the pilgrims vary from full-length portraits to mere thumbnail sketches. Sometimes one line is enough for the poet to give representation to a human figure, but in all, the external features are the things that matter. The poet believes that the face is an index to character and that apparel often proclaims the man, and after having studied them, the poet gives his own estimates of the person. Chaucer's point of view is secular, homely, and private. Even in his poetic devices, he is essentially a poet of the homely surroundings. It is thus that Chaucer presents the whole 14th century England in the lines of his poem, its body and soul, its actuality and its emotional reaches. Neville Coghill has a brilliant paragraph in which he sums up the excellence of Chaucer's realism. I quote, "A quizzical but affirmative delight in the created world, an eye for the immediate image, and an ear for the natural music of speech gathered their forces to express in the prologue. The greatness of his work lies not only in the pleasure of so sharp and happy-hearted a sight of times past, but also in the power it imparts to us to see men and women, our own contemporaries, with a like vision, a like sympathy and amusement, a like intelligence in their individual actuality. Every reader of the prologue feels he has learned to open a Chaucerian eye upon the world." So, this was all about how the idea of realism is taken up by Chaucer in his work, The Canterbury Tales. I hope the podcast proved to be of help to each one of you. Please leave your comment. Please do like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to click on the bell icon for latest update. Thank you for your valuable time. Here's wishing you a great day ahead.